Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Before I hand over to our moderator, Dave Duke, I just wanted to go into a few housekeeping items that will make the viewing better for yourselves. It is best to access the webinar via Chrome or Firefox. Unfortunately, if you're logged in via Internet Explorer, then you may not be able to access all features, such as the chat, as IE is not optimized for this stream. During the webinar, we want to make it as interactive as possible, so please feel free to ask questions either via the chat or the questions tab. We will be monitoring this and then we will ask our presenters to answer these. If we happen to run out of time and don't get around to your question, don't worry, any unanswered questions will be answered post-webinar. After the webinar, we shall also be making the link to the recording, plus any questions and answers or any useful information available on our website for you to download and view at a time convenient for yourself. So now I will hand over to Dave Duke to take us through our webinar, How to Secure Your Supply Chain in the New Normal.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks once again for joining us for another GemTALK. I'm sorry that I must once again say that the weather outside is fantastic and I can smell barbecues and hear kids playing in paddling pools for the second time in succession. So once again, no pressure on our presenters to deliver, knowing that you've forsaken all of that to be here on a laptop with us. I don't know if there's a causal link, but if and when we end the GemTALK series, and there are 7 scheduled each week, an overview is available on the website of each one if you want to take a look and see the topics in advance. But if we end that series and the sun goes in, I'm afraid I may have to ask our team to do some overtime while I take some annual leave on the basis of this link between good weather and our webinars. Anyway, as I've said before, on these webinars, we're in a really unique position as GemServe, delivering game-changing health services and game-changing cyber technology services. That health sector expertise really feeds into the support and expertise on the cyber side. And so I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about what we're seeing in our health division based on work ensuring the ongoing delivery of healthcare transformation by successfully switching to remote working, and also directly supporting the crisis response in supporting the development of Nightingale capacity. So just before I talk to what we see from our health experts, I'd like to set out the agenda for today and introduce our 3 experts in terms of supply chain continuity. So the things we'll look at in the webinar, we've got Ian Rutland, who will look at how you can minimise your security and resilience risks when moving services or applications to cloud service providers. Ian will look at some of the common misconceptions and misunderstandings between service providers and clients and provide tips on how these can be resolved based on extensive experience. He'll also provide advice on how you can optimise assurance of existing security solutions to get the most from them, and give advice which will complement Andy Green's threat briefing from the previous GemTALK webinar, which is available again on our website to view retrospectively. We'll then move on to Ian Davis, who will talk about continuity in the supply chain. I call this the planning for the when, not if. And Ian's a renowned business continuity expert with wide-ranging experience from delivering business continuity systems for major oil and gas organisations in the Middle East, national banks in Eastern Europe, through to business continuity advice and training for major UK and European organisations. So he'll look at how to build in resilience and agility, acknowledging, as the health context will set out, that change is one of the few certainties. And he'll give advice on what he sees across a range of organisations, looking at continuity in terms of people and technology in IT, OT, as well as touching on cloud environments, carrying on from where Ian Rutland left off. We'll then move through to Graham Pattison, so a break from the Ians, and Graham will talk about the new normal. Graham's an experienced principal consultant in digital transformation and IT-enabled change, and he'll give advice and examples to help you consider what the anticipated cycle of COVID-19 means in terms of supplier selection and relationships. So before I talk about that, setting the context of health, as I say, a final point, just picking up on Michelle's point around the format for this webinar. Whatever your views and actions of the media focus of the past few days, we probably all have that Dominic Cummings type of view of seeing everything through the lens of our own experience. So having a specific interpretation of how to apply guidance, whether it's health or cyber, is important. So we'll try and tailor things as much as possible here, but do ask us about your specific circumstances, challenges, opportunities, either on this webinar through the chat, or if you don't want to ask in an open forum, ask us at cyber@gemserve.com and we'll respond to you. We are here to help. So look, I said that I'd talk about the context of the pandemic first of all, and as you can see from the agenda, we'll then move through these 4 topics. So to give you an overview of the pandemic context as our health experts see it, I want to talk you through this next slide, which gives a visual representation of the way that it's anticipated that the journey to the new normal, or perhaps the normal now, based on situations from the last week, will pan out. So you'll see from the top here that it's a combination or a mixture of movement from relief into recovery, into relief phases and back again. So what have we been doing during the relief phase? Well, as an organisation, GemServe has been totally committed to supporting our healthcare customers through the first phase of this pandemic, and we're starting to move into the recovery phase now. And in hindsight, we've seen that this actually shared many aspects of relief efforts from natural disasters. It's about protecting life, and it's about maintaining continuity of service. And as I said, some of our relief efforts involved delivering healthcare transformation, switching to remote working, and as I mentioned, supporting some of the Nightingale capacity in terms of its development. So we're moving now into the first recovery phase, and that's about moving from recovery from the initial relief effort, balancing that difficult conundrum of health versus wealth as the country start to plan how to coexist with COVID-19 until, or indeed if, a vaccine is found. Now, left unchecked, we said last week and previously that we'd start and expect to see outbreaks on a national or regional basis, and we're starting to see this already. We expect to see multiple waves, as you can see from the diagram here, with the anticipated timeline between 12 to 18 months, although this may change. And between each wave, between the relief and the recovery phases, we'll see our health services try and catch up with an ever increasing backlog of care, both in terms of cancelled elective work and new diagnosis. So there's a challenge there in terms of managing the existing or previous normal, as well as managing the new normal. And there will be impacts in terms of increasing mental health issues as well, as you can see here in terms of the potential impacts at the bottom of the slide. So what action does government and society take? Well, it's likely to be more of the same: social distancing, drug development, treatment and cure are key, but again, they could take the whole of this timeline in terms of the 12 to 18 months. And we move from outbreak containment, we move to outbreak containment. So this is about the R number based on lockdowns on a regional basis, as I mentioned earlier, mass testing for disease and antibodies, mass contact tracing. And of course, combining this information may become critical, but it may also challenge existing privacy law. So those are some of the things that we need to take into consideration about how far we want to go and how we want to balance these things. We continue to shield. There are 1.5 million plus at risk. So there are questions about how do you help those people keep safe in their home whilst restarting the economy. Technology's got a key part to play in terms of creating safety. There are assistive technologies such as the ones that we're working on in some of our healthcare transformation work. And we've already seen an example of cross-government thinking to ensure that the vulnerable don't have their power disconnected. So we expect to see that continue. And we continue to embrace the new normal. So working from home, collaborative technologies. For example, Teams was rolled out across the NHS in a period of just over 4 days. And we'll all have to look to embrace technology to drive a better normal. And that will be, to an extent, mirrored by the health sector embracing technology to drive a better normal, such as GPs doing online consultations, telehealth. And of course, all of these technology changes which mirror and match those healthcare periods that we see, that relief to recovery flow, are driven by keeping us distributed and underpinned by technology. So much of the new normal is technology enabled, and as we move further into recovery, cybersecurity moves ever closer to the top of the risk register. And this was something that our health experts pointed out to us when they spoke directly last week. Unfortunately, they're unable to be with us this week because of the fact that the pandemic peaks and ebbs and flows. And so some of the important work that they're doing has required them to go back to that this afternoon. But I think it's important to provide you with this context, because this ebb and flow, as I say, the relief to recovery and back again, will feed into many decisions that all of us have to make. And particularly in the context of this webinar, some of the decisions we'll have to make in relation to the way that we manage supply, the way that we bring on board services, and the way that we think about how those services are fit for purpose moving forward. So on to the next slide. In summary, where are we today? So this is talking back to the slide that you've just seen. We've moved from crisis to recovery. There are different responses to data and system and technology across different sectors and organisations. As I mentioned, we all have to look at this through our own lens as to what is reasonable, what works for us. What can we assume about tomorrow? Well, I've touched on most of it. We're talking about the vaccine, the cure, or the treatment really driving the timescales for how long this new normal stays in place. And that will be reflected in the business environment in terms of the decisions that people make, in terms of the way that we deploy our workforces. And of course, adding to that will be the elements such as further lockdowns, social distancing, and of course, ultimately, whether we can get those vulnerable 1.5 million into a position where actually we're able to shield them safely. So that's where we're at today in summary. And I just wanted to kind of bring that all together before I move through to hand over the reins to Ian Rutland. So where will it take us in future, this pandemic? Our operating models will have changed. They probably already have done. Rapidly adopted technologies will need to be considered in terms of those operating models. We'll need to be very agile in terms of the way that we operate and the way that we work. And of course, as part of that, security and information governance, information and cybersecurity will need thinking about, and in many cases, will need a retrofit. And the final point, we can't separate wealth from health, either at an individual level or across society. And when we talk about wealth in this context, this is about operate in the business environment, the way that we drive forward our economy, and the way that that is interlinked to the slide that I showed you in terms of the recovery and the the cycle of the lockdown as it's likely to be for the next 18 months. So look, without further ado, and with that setting the context, I'll hand over to Ian Rutland to talk a little bit about cloud services in that context. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Dave. So next slide, please. So as you can see, one of the most significant trends that we're seeing within the cybersecurity arena currently, migrating or the increasing migration across to the cloud computing environment. Increasingly, this is by the small to medium enterprises, and I think the driver behind this is that the cloud environment is seen as being safer and perhaps more resilient to the traditional on-prem deployment. However, where the cloud deployment brings significant uplift to the security capability, this ability needs to be delivered in an efficient manner that meets the requirements of the client or the customer. This is due mostly to the misconceptions and misunderstandings between what the service provider offers and what the client or the customer believes that they're paying for the service. And the key consideration here is the shared responsibility model, so that there's clear understanding where one's responsibility ends and another starts, and also ensuring that it meets the requirements of the business. Increasingly, the cybersecurity attacks in 2019, Symantec reported 78% increasing, and this trend is increasing throughout 2020 so far. But also because of the supply chain is becoming more digital, it's not just the main businesses that are increasingly the targets, but also the smaller supply chain partners with perhaps a less mature cyber footprint are becoming the weakest link in the chain. So next slide, please. So here we're looking at the shared responsibility model. This is one in comparison to Microsoft. And as you can see across the top, it ranges from software as a service, platform and an infrastructure as a service, through to the traditional on-site deployment. Now, with the traditional on-site deployment, everything from the provision of the location through to the hardware, the operating systems, all the way through to data governance, authentication, password security, that was all within the remit of the customer. It was their network. However, with the deployment towards the cloud environment and the different options available to the client now, that responsibility is it's almost like a sliding scale almost, depending on what service that you require. So if we look at the infrastructure as a service, the provider, the cloud provider, will provide everything up to the physical hosts, which the operating system will then sit on. But the operating system and above will be the responsibility for the customer to provide. Moving across to platform, the cloud provider will provide up to the operating system. And then you start seeing the shared responsibilities where it comes to network controls, application, and the identity management and authentication. And these shared responsibilities need to be agreed between the cloud provider and the customer. And sometimes it may be that there's an additional cost involved to get the full service. Lastly, software as a service, the cloud provider provides everything up to the application, and then the customer themselves provide the account management above, and then there's a shared responsibility where it comes to the identification or the identity and directory infrastructure. So the key consideration on this is really to understand what it is that what your requirement is, the business requirement, and how the selection of the product meets that requirement. An example could be that a client might require a certain element of resilience, and it's believed that the cloud service provider provides that as a matter of course. But what does that resilience mean? Does that mean that it's a complete backup, or is it just perhaps 28 days worth of data on a rolling basis? Obviously, two are distinctly different. The backup itself might be a completely different service, which may have an additional cost attached to it, but then also it may be worth considering whether or not the backup service is provided by an alternative cloud provider, and therefore there may be an agreement has to be put into place with the original provider to extract data from that platform and transfer it across to another. So moving on to the next slide, please.
Ian, if I may, it's a really interesting point you made there in terms of the shared responsibility model about understanding the business requirement, which I guess is very important, and I think Graham Patterson will touch on that a little bit later. But you mentioned that this was an example compared to Microsoft. There's a big difference, isn't there, between the responsiveness of some suppliers, so those smaller partners that you mentioned earlier versus, you know, an AWS or a Microsoft Azure. How do you balance that out in your view between, you know, what works best from an agility perspective versus what works best from a security perspective?
Okay, so I think from agility perspective, I think possibly the smaller providers might be more agile in the development and the deployment of their model. Conversely, though, from experience with some of them, some client work I've done previously with Azure, the Microsoft model can be equally as responsive. I think the key consideration is, does it meet your business requirements? Is there a firm understanding between the client and the provider of what that requirement is and how they can be supported? And I think I think the other bit is what sort of commercial engagement there is between the customer and the provider. Again, I think they all mutually support themselves.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned about the sort of firm requirement between yourself and the provider as well, which I guess is critical. And I guess this isn't just a question for you; it's a question probably for all of the presenters. But are there any top tips that you would give in terms of, you know, getting and defining those firm requirements? Because that, I guess, can be quite difficult at the definition stage, particularly when you're faced with, you know, a number of providers who promise that they'll all do everything for you.
Yeah, certainly. So I think the first key point is that as a customer moving on to a cloud environment, you have to have a clear understanding of what it is that you need, and if that means you know, going right back to perhaps a business case analysis or understanding the cloud deployment terminology, that should be the first step. I think the second step then is to ensure that terminology meets and matches your business expectation, so that when you approach a supplier and you're talking about resilience or you're talking about backup, you're both talking the same language. Does that answer your question, Dave? Sorry.
Yeah, that's perfect. I don't know whether I was seeing whether Graham or Ian wanted to interject at all, but if not,
yeah. One of the things I was going to say later on, I know since you've brought it up now, is there's a big difference between buying bespoke and buying commodity. One of the things you have to be very clear about, especially on the cloud, is what it is you're actually buying. Because with the best in the world, Google are not going to change their terms and conditions for you. So that really is a commodity buy, and it's much more emphasis on yourself to understand what it is that they are really selling you, where the gaps are, and especially in terms of backup and recovery, we know there are gaps in all the cloud providers in terms of what they do for you in terms of backup and recovery. There's always there's extra charges in that. So I think there's more emphasis on yourself to understand what it is you're buying, and if that meets your needs, rather than being able to push back onto the suppliers to say, no, we want you to change this for us.
Thanks, Graham. And I won't cut into your topic any further at this stage, but that probably brings us quite nicely through to your slide, Ian, in terms of Ian Rutland, in terms of mitigating the risks and understanding your cloud estate.
Absolutely. So, like I say, that's key. Following from what Graham was saying there, you know, you have to have a really intricate knowledge of what your estate is, what your business requirement is. Again, a good knowledge of what it is, or a good research knowledge of what it is being provided by any potential supplier, and how that best can be used to meet your business requirements, your business need. Obviously, part of this as well is in ensuring that you're, the best practice to meet your requirements. There's some examples there on best practice regarding cloud security in ISO 27017. And again, it's following the best practice, having an understanding of what what that is, how that applies to your business particularly, and how to get the best out of the offering from the cloud service provider.
Excellent. Thanks, Ian. So I think we now move on to the next Ian, Ian Davis, to talk a little bit, picking up from there, about supply chain continuity. Ian Davis, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. And I'll probably come back to some things that that Ian Rutland's just spoken about as I go through this, and some of the things that I've found. So I'm very much focused on continuity of the supply chain, both as we enter this recovery period and moving forwards. And I'm going to look at some of the issues that I've found over the last couple of months with clients and people that I speak to, and issues that they're having with that supply chain, and this is from varied sectors. Excuse me. And the first biggest issue is risk assessment. I'm surprised at the number of organizations that I talk to that have not revisited their risk assessment. We've gone into a crisis and they're still managing through it. They've not pulled back and said, okay, we've got a risk assessment. Effectively, some of those risks and related mitigations, may still be relevant, but have we assessed the new scenario that we find ourselves in? And hopefully, organizations have risk assessed their supply chain, and that is a key component of continuity within the supply chain, is go back and revisit that risk assessment, and start asking questions around that supply chain, particularly in relation to single suppliers, especially if they're critical. Is your supply chain still viable? Which is a big question there. Do we actually know what's going on with our suppliers? And some organizations, if I think of some within oil and gas, for example, where numbers of suppliers runs into tens of thousands, but within that scope, we've brought the critical suppliers down into the hundreds, but it's still a lot. And have we looked at our supply chain, big or large? Is our supply chain still viable? Do we need to start looking early at replacement, or putting in some resilience in there? And as part of that, are our suppliers maintaining the service levels? Now, that can be difficult in this time, and we all know that good communication can assist with the with working with suppliers and working with our supply chain, to identify any areas where, if there is difficulty, we can look at perhaps relaxing some of that service level in order to make sure that supply remains viable. And then there's some practical elements around it as we look at this, and we go through our governance and risks with our suppliers. Are they doing the right thing? Are they performing their security awareness training with staff? Are they looking at protecting against what is quite a significant increase in the uptake of phishing and ransomware that's occurred, particularly over the last 2 to 3 weeks? Are they, a lot of organizations are taking advantage of staff retention schemes, both here in the UK and overseas. But for some, it's the opposite. Some suppliers are having to upscale, and how are they addressing that in terms of controls, in terms of, are they relaxing their previous governance environment in order to bring those people on, particularly as they can't do a lot of the face-to-face stuff, and operating through those, looking at suppliers where, you may be a 24/7 operation. Are the controls still there to support that around the clock, when we are operating with, in some cases, significantly reduced resource, and particularly, in some sectors. I was on a conference call last week where organizations were talking about they've entered into staff retention schemes, but that means that they do have staff on furlough, and they're struggling to operate their governance processes. So it's just adapting to that. And again, that feeds into the risk assessment. Do we know the risks that we've actually got at the moment?
Ian, just on the risk assessment point, because I picked up what you said there about it being key and also about prioritising. You gave the example of thousands of suppliers and then sort of narrowing them down to hundreds, but it's still being a challenge. Have you got a view in terms of how you keep supply chain management manageable to cope with that relief recovery fluctuation, which might mean that you're having to review the services and the suppliers on a pretty regular basis?
Well, it's a lot easier if people had looked at business continuity before this incident, but you can't shut the door after the horse has bolted, which is what many organizations are trying to do, and so they've got to adjust. I had a conversation with the CEO of an organization that totally bought continuity. This was back in January, and one of the things he said to me when I was looking at availability of premises was he could not see a scenario whereby the office would be unavailable for more than 24 hours. Now, that was back in January. People just could not, if we talk lockdowns, etc., they could not perceive it as a concept. So it is adjusting to it. But when you've got a substantial supply chain, it's looking at those. Many of those will be in areas of multiple supply. So the first thing to focus on is those areas of criticality, particularly with single suppliers, because you're going to have to jump on those fairly quickly as we try to return back to normal. We also have to keep in mind that where organizations have failed, there's going to be a significant number of of people looking to procure replacement services, and if they're in a particular industry, then you may find it's a fairly competitive environment there. So that risk assessment side of it's about identifying your suppliers, identifying the critical suppliers, the single suppliers, and focusing on managing those first.
Makes sense.
Okay, if you go on to the next slide, please. So just within that, the first aspect is people, and I've talked a little bit about staff retention, but looking at both your own organization, including your procurement and your service management side, but also people within your supply chain, are they available, and what stresses are being put by staff retention schemes and reductions. And as I just sort of hinted, one of the things that I've come across in the last week are some big household UK names that have said we can't conduct compliance activities at the moment because of too many of our people are on furlough. So if that's happening within the organization itself, it's also happening in your supply chain. And so, when you're communicating with the supply chain, as part of that risk assessment, is getting an idea to what are the resource constraints that they may be feeling as well, and are they still able to supply what they were doing in business as usual? Are they maintaining robust security of remote working? If your supplier has remote working procedures, have they adapted to that? And here, I think for the last 20 years, we've increased the amount of home working that people do, but for a lot of employees, this is the first time that they've done it, and they are not necessarily aware of remote working policies and procedures. For those people that worked at home, I think of myself, for example, I work at home quite often, and I'm very aware of GemTALK, what GemTALK's remote working policy is. We've reviewed and reissued with what's going on at the moment, but I'm aware of GemTALK's governance and policy around remote working. Employees who don't normally remote work have not had a reason to look at those policies and procedures. They may not be aware of it, and that extends to your supply chain as well. What is happening, within those key suppliers in terms of how they're managing this? Are they conducting security awareness training for their new home workers and their new remote workers to deal with the increase in home environment threats, shared accommodation? Common, particularly within the younger element of the workforce, and again, the home environment being a new target for phishing and ransomware. And then the final point on people, again, that I've touched on is people that are upscaling during the during this pandemic. Has screening been left to one side? How are they approaching this? Are they still doing what they were doing before, or for the ease, convenience, or cost, have some controls fallen by the wayside? That's something that you need to be aware of in terms of supply chain to make sure that your supply chain remains robust. If I could go on to the next one, please. So looking at technology, IT and OT, and again, this applies to your own organizations as well, but it's also something to look at within the supply chain. Are people using home equipment? And therefore exposing themselves to the vulnerabilities that are around there. If your suppliers have employees that are sat using a home PC, and they're pretty much going to be using a home broadband router, I have not seen statistics recently on the number of home broadband routers that are believed to still be set to vendor defaults, but I would imagine it's pretty high. And that's the same for any home use kit that people are using. So we've got to be aware of those lack of security controls that can exist in the home working workplace. We've also got issues with home service providers. Are we exposed to the failure of a single ISP? There was an issue early on in the lockdown where Virgin Media, for example, had some downtime. Okay, it was fairly brief, but it did knock out an awful lot of people for a period. Now, if we had an extended failure of a single ISP, how many organizations have a lot of their key players exposed to that single ISP? And so how much resilience is there, both within your own organization, but also looking at your communication channels with your supply chain, which may be being done home to home? What is your exposure to a single ISP failure? I know very few organizations that have looked at that. Having talked to them about it, I do know some that have now come back and looked at, we could lose 30 to 40% depending on the ISP that goes down. And so it is, as we're looking at how do we deal with future returns to a lockdown, something to bear in mind, particularly for key people, key suppliers. Are there multiple communication channels available for that? In terms of replacement equipment and the security and provisioning, how are people approaching that? Again, are controls suffering because of the scenario that we're in? How are suppliers provisioning their equipment? Is this going straight out from a warehouse? If they don't have a functioning ICT department, how is that replacement equipment being provisioned, being imaged, etc.? Or are costs being cut and therefore risks increasing by just shipping out replacements that haven't gone through the same degree of control and hardening as they would during business as usual. And if we just go on to this one, and this touches on something that Ian Rutland was talking about earlier. So I'm not going to go in great detail over it, as Ian's already spoken. But one of the key things that I talk about here that Ian touched on is around stored information, around resilience, and around backups. Particularly in terms of your own, but also your suppliers and access to that information. And it brings me back to a conversation I had last year before this all started with a client who was using a major cloud provider. And one of the questions that I put to them when we were looking at risk was, what happens if there's a failure of that provider who has all of your data, and they have everything? And they sort of said, well, we haven't actually thought of that, so we'll go and put it to them. And they put it to them, and this happened to be Oracle. And the response back was, well, we've not been asked that before. You know, we're Oracle, nothing's going to happen. And I'd just like to sort of go back to, nobody thought there would be a lockdown. Nobody could perceive a full lockdown just a few months ago. Therefore, you know, is it that implausible that one of the big players in cloud provisioning could suffer difficulty or even failure, and what would happen in the result, that, you know, as a result of that, or you know, a less catastrophic event again where we have communication issues. And that's where I look at with people, you know, what resilience do you have in that data? A lot of organizations have just dispensed with the notion of backup, and adopted the view that, well, you know, the provider's got it, the provider's got multiple, you know, has got this data over multiple dispersed locations. You know, we don't need to worry about that. But you know, the danger is, you know, ranges from a failure of that provider through to a major compromise, ransomware, etc., where their controls fail. And what then have you got in terms of a data backup, and how often is it refreshed? And therefore, people need to start revisiting, you know, what have they got in terms of resilience within data. And if that means that you know, there is another site that is outside of that cloud provision, that information is mirrored to, then you know, that may be an option that you need to look at. But then there's all the aspects in this period that we're going through that we need to review, and it does sort of feed back to what I said earlier about repeating the risk assessment, revisiting the risk assessment, looking at how things have changed, information in transit, physical access during restricted periods, changes to governance, effects on controls in terms of screening, user management, monitoring, authentication, all of those things. You know, are those controls still there? Are those controls still robust? And you know, can we identify early if there's going to be an issue with a supplier there? And finally, just some tools that can help us there. And again, things we can refer to, the well-known ISO standards, and frameworks by NIST and COBIT, and just looking at, as we're moving through the recovery stage, and we're starting to look at our procurement channels. We're starting to rebuild our supply chain baseline, looking at what are we going to do to help with governance moving forwards and help us with securing that supply chain. So if you haven't already, it is a good time to start looking at, within your procurement framework, what are you going to start requiring of your suppliers in order to make this whole governance and management of those suppliers easier moving forwards, particularly as we potentially get repeat lockdowns across the country and maybe internationally.
Ian, thanks for that. A lot to consider. A lot of really useful points, I think. You finished off by just pointing to the fact that it is likely that there will be future lockdowns, and I think from the health context, we know that the cycle of relief and recovery is showing that probably as in 1918 and 1920, the risk of the pandemic getting worse is clear.
Yeah.
Statistically, we see that already in the UK. So I guess in that context, plan for the unthinkable, the major provider going down, the office being unavailable, is the sort of message. Are there any key unthinkables that you would, if you had to take 3 things away from today amongst all of the things you've spoken about in terms of those unthinkables, what would they be?
Well, I think you've got to take advantage of the fact that we're entering this this period now that could last several months, where we've almost got a little bit of breathing space. I think everybody's starting to look at, as you've heard, going back to back 100 and so years with the Spanish flu, where the second impact was worse, and so we have to potentially look forward to the winter period where if we're going to look at the unthinkable, it is that we're in a worse situation to what we are now. And the lockdown that we've just had for several months will be even more severe. And there is the potential there for that. So I think the key thing for people to look at the moment is to review their performance over the last couple of months. And look at what went well, what did not go well, how is our supply chain, what do we need to replace, etc. But then take advantage of the anything from 1 to 5 months that we may have before if that second lockdown, major lockdown, does occur, then we need to prepare for that, and we need to get these business impact analysis done, and we need to be more prepared for the next one than we were for this one.
So preparation is key, which leads us nicely into Graham Patterson, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about planning supply chain management, which links on nicely. Graham, I'm conscious of time, so I'll hand over to you now, and we'll go for some questions at the end. Equally, if anyone has some whilst Graham's talking, either on the 2 Ians or what Graham's saying, please do that by the chat.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Dave. I'm going to be relatively quick because an awful lot of what I want to cover has already been said. This is about really getting ready for the new normal, the better normal, whatever the names keep changing, whatever it is. We talk about pandemic, and we talk about the effect of a pandemic, and we talk about the supply chain. Just an example from not that long ago, which was 2011, the Japanese earthquakes in 2011 that actually had a major effect on the technology supply chain, took out a lot of chip manufacturers. And just to emphasize Ian's point about how far back you need to go in your supply chain, one of the things that got taken out was a glue manufacturer in Kyoto, which is great, except that they all glue the chips together, and you suddenly found that a whole load of microchips weren't available. Computer production was going down. HP were having problems. Everyone was having problems because a glue manufacturer in the supply chain had become quite central to it. So I just want to make that point, that when you're thinking about what the supply chain is, it's actually quite long, and it's quite easy to get back to single instances where everybody's relying on one firm, one manufacturer inside an industry. So having said that, I've talked here about understanding the current state and plan for the transition phase. We tend to use, in digital transformation, we tend to talk about a transition phase rather than a recovery phase, which is what the health people refer to the same thing as. But the important part of it is, where are you now? You aren't where you were 3 months ago. It's changed. 2 points. One is, has anything happened with your risk? And part of that is you might be using things that come for free. Suppliers and in the first of these talks, we actually did talk about some of the people like Zoom, some people like Microsoft, that were actually offering up services for free. They're not going to be free come September, yeah, or maybe October, or maybe they're not going to be free forever. You're going to have to work out how you do with them. And the last point on this, understanding the current state, just the last bullet point there, which we have had some discussion about, is this whole thing about shadow IT. Especially since they've been working from home, especially since they've, especially your younger employees, shall we say, they're going to be using shadow IT. I can guarantee it. I mean, if in something like the financial services, when they weren't in lockdown, when everybody wasn't working from home, you were getting people using text messages to avoid having to use the main audited systems. Believe me, at the moment, people are going to use shadow IT, and the only way you can get that is to actually find a way to get it out into the open. And I'm saying, have some sort of amnesty, let people tell you. I mean, inside GemServe, when we started to ask people about, and this was prior to the lockdown, prior to the pandemic, we started to ask people about what they were doing with IT that they thought was exciting. We found people using a system called Trello, which is like a project planning. Because it was much better for them in terms of cooperation with outside than to go back and rely completely on email. So there is things that, once you've understood where you are currently, you've got all the where do you want to be, and that's very much based on where do you want your business to be. What's your future operational model going to be like? It is unlikely, given that we're probably going to have some more waves. It's unlikely that we're going to have the same operational model as you had. Inside GemServe, we're talking about not having to get back into the office. We can't get the same number of people into the offices. I suspect WeWork, who were in a bad way anyway, but I suspect their operating model is going to have problems. But not just them. Regis are much more profitable than we ever were, but they rely on actually renting out office space. Now, their long-term rentals go, but a lot more short-term rentals. And then you're going to have to take that in terms of your risks and in terms of, you know, if you're moving people together for a short project or something like that in an office, what are you going to do with that? But once you've understood where you are, what your current state is, and you can start to get your plans together, and you start to look at where the risks are and where your priorities have to be, because you're not going to be able to sort out everything that's gone on. Where is it going to be to do with regulatory? Is it going to be maintaining your cash? Is it going to be something in the supply chain that's giving you problems? You're not going to be able to do it all at once, so you need to actually start to prioritize what's there. And we'd always recommend prioritizing our own risk. We'd always recommend understanding what your risk appetite is, which really starts the whole process. Ian was sorry, both Ians were talking about in terms of your risk and what your risk profile is. And I believe that one of the future talks we're going to talk about risk appetite for companies and how to actually understand what your risk appetite is and how to come up with an enumeration of it. So that gives you where you are, and you can start to plan where you want to be. If you want to move on to the next slide, please. Then it's about getting on with it, starting with priority services. Looking at what you've looked at, where your risks are, you know where you need to start to put in more resilience in your supply chain. And that's about good procurement. Now, good procurement is good procurement. There is a whole set of things you need to understand when you're buying, when you're acquiring, or whatever term you want to use for it. And that's, why are you buying it? What's the business requirement that's behind all this? Because otherwise you're not going to know whether it's worth it or not. Due diligence, there's a potential that actually, because you've got things quickly, in terms of handling the current situation, you haven't done as much due diligence as you would have done normally. You can go back and do it. You can go back to it again, but also understanding where the fallback is if things aren't working properly, and that is about understanding your due diligence, understanding your contracts, understanding what it is you signed up for. And I just very quickly going to finish off with going back to what I was saying earlier on, David, which is really around the whole thing of commodity buying. Increasingly with cloud, increasingly with services on the cloud, what people are buying is a commodity service. So you buy Zoom and you buy Zoom. Yeah, it does what it says on the box, or sometimes not very securely, but it generally does what it says on the box. And it will be improved. We've seen Microsoft put through a whole loads of improvements on Teams in the last few months. They've been accelerating ones that were being demanded. But what you bought is what you bought. Your chance of going back and renegotiating and negotiating the deal with Google or with AWS, you're not going to get much movement off their standard terms and conditions, but you have to understand them so you can put in the mitigation around them. Again, aware of the time. I think, as I said, a lot of what I was going to say has already been covered. We knew that was going to happen, so that's just a run through, and it's very standard. It's very standard digital transformation, which is understand where you are, work out where you need to be, and then start to produce how you close the gap, being aware of what it is you've got, what your priorities, what you need to get done first. So at that point, I'll stop and just give a few minutes for questions. So,
Graham, thanks for that. Look, we've talked about quite a lot. I mentioned at the start that if you're in the webinar, please do. There's also the cyber@gemserve webpage, and we provide a wide range of cybersecurity supply chain support relevant to this, which I think is just showing up on screen now. I want to open it up to a couple of questions. Suffice to say, in terms of this graphic, these are some of the areas and some of the approaches that we think are useful, and we'll share those after the webinar is finished so that you can access those. Please do draw on us for support. This is the type of model that we use to help our clients to run through this. So just before we finish, and just tying back to Graham Patterson's point, there's a sense in terms of that contract negotiation or existing service provider negotiation, which ties in with, I think, what Ian Rutland and Ian Davis were saying, that it's very much about communicating and managing collaboratively. That's collaboratively is a key point. I guess one of the questions is that it's often multi-stakeholder relationships with these suppliers. So you'll have IT, procurement, compliance and data protection teams, operations teams such as delivery and marketing, and it can be complex even at the procurement stage to negotiate and communicate collaboratively with a supplier across that many teams. Any thoughts in terms of how you can manage that from the three people on the panel?
I mean, we're managing an awful lot of sharing and communication that's going on, and we've learned, everybody's learned to do it very quickly in terms of the technology that we can use, the technology for securely exchanging messages, securely exchanging documents, the ability to actually have face-to-face without having face-to-face. So I think really taking what we've learned in terms of operating the organization internally and starting to spread that out with our collaborators is probably about the best advice I could give at the moment.
Thanks, Graham. I don't think we've got any more questions come through on the chat, so I'll open that question up to Ian Davis and Ian Rutland in terms of, as I say, that any tips in terms of communicating with those suppliers in a multi-stakeholder environment.
Well, I think you first got to identify, what you require of that supplier, and this is particularly relevant if you're replacing suppliers or you're improving resilience. So you're bringing new suppliers in. What are your expectations, and do they understand your expectations? So you've really got to know yourself what you're going to require of the supplier. A lot of organizations do that with and are quite clear when they've got suppliers of, for example, physical goods, and also to a degree with services, but it's almost completely missing from cloud provision and IT provision, particularly when you're dealing with the big boys who dictate the terms. It's almost a role reversal where they're dictating to you what the terms and conditions are going to be. But in that sort of situation, you've got to protect yourselves in terms of what's our data and is our data protected. But in terms of your supply chain, as you're either strengthening it, expanding it, replacing it, whatever it is, you need to actually identify yourself. What are your expectations, and how are you going to communicate that to the supplier?
Ian, thanks very much. Look, I'm conscious that we've hit the 4 o'clock mark, so appreciating the time of the attendees. As I said at the start, we're available to support. You can contact us at cyber@GemServe. It's not a case that the clock starts ticking as soon as you do so, so please do feel free to ask us. And with that, I would point you also to the fact that, as I mentioned, this is a series of GemTALK. So next week, we'll be talking a little bit more with some experts and some external experts about some of the challenges and the opportunities in terms of some of the cultural aspects of moving to the new normal from a cybersecurity perspective. So thanks everybody for your time. We'll start to wrap up now, and I'll hand back to Michelle to draw this to a close. Thank you to the presenters also.
Yes, thank you, Dave, and to our presenters, Ian and Graham, for an informative and interesting webinar. As mentioned, a link to the recording and any useful links will be posted on our website for all of you to access. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great week, and we hope you will join us again next time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.